celebrations in the Sudanese capital after the announcement that a constitutional declaration has been agreed. The country has been in uproar for months since a protest movement ousted dictator Omar al-Bashir. We'll hear from an activist in Khartoum later in the program. More pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong this weekend. The police warns protesters to stick to designated routes after violent clashes marred the last 8 weekends of rallies. And Puerto Rico's new governor is sworn in after Ricardo Rosselló stepped down in response to weeks of popular protests. But Pedro Pierluisi still needs to be confirmed by the Senate. Hello and welcome back to the France 24 Newsroom. I'm Anka Ola. Thank you for joining us again. Sudan is one step closer to civilian rule. In the early hours on Saturday, the African Union announced that the country's military rulers and main opposition have agreed on a constitutional declaration. It would outline the division of power for a 3-year transition to elections. Officials from both sides will continue talks today to hammer out the technical details of that agreement. Let's hear from the African Union mediator, Mohamed El Hassan Libat.
I am very happy. In the name of the African mediation and in the name of the 2 negotiating parties, to announce to the Sudanese public, the national, international, and African public, that the 2 delegations have completely agreed on a constitutional declaration.
Well, for more on this story, let's cross live now to Khalid Ali in Khartoum. He's a civil activist in Sudan. Thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. Now, people are celebrating in the streets. We've seen images of them out after this agreement. Does this agreement mean that the revolution has succeeded?
This is an important milestone in the trajectory of the resistance of the Sudanese people to the military dictatorship. It's obviously a very important one, but no, the revolution has not been concluded yet. Actually, the more difficult part starts now. The agreement that has been reached is important in the sense that it now removes any excuses for the military junta that's in power right now from practically transitioning power to a civilian government. The deal itself, the agreement itself, it still hasn't been announced, the details of it, so we're still not very sure. I mean, they always say the devil is in the detail, and we're looking forward to see what the details entail. But in general and in principle, this is a good step forward. The revolution continues until a full and complete transition to civilian governance is achieved.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we've been seeing is they're going to outline the division of power for a 3-year transition to elections. 3 years seems like an awfully long time to wait to hold elections. Is that an appropriate timeline, do you think, for that kind of action?
Well, from the perspective of the FFC, this period has been calculated. I mean, you realize this comes after Sudan is emerging from 30 long years of military dictatorship backed by the Islamists. During these 30 years, a lot of damage has been done to institutions, including political parties, civil society organizations, and all of that. So the 3 years hasn't been a number that's just been picked. It's being calculated based on a reform program on multi-levels, and it's a lot of work, it's hard work, but we're hoping that by the end of this transition period that we have re-established a platform from which a real democracy can start and initiate. So, I mean, the answer is no, it's not very long. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Okay, and then what about justice for the protesters who were killed? Is there a provision also expected to address that?
This is exactly one of the details that are still not very clear. This has been a contention point in the negotiations for a very long time. It's been back and forth. What the people of Sudan expect is that there are very clear provisions about accountability and justice, not only for the martyrs of the December movement, but all the way back to people who were killed in Darfur and people who were killed in Nuba Mountains and different places. under the previous regime. It is very important that the sense of impunity with which the military has been operating for a very long time is ended. This is a main one of the main points of the revolution, and we're still to be seen when the details of the agreement are disclosed to the public.
Well, thank you very much, Khalid Ali. Like you said, the devil is in the details. We will be waiting for those details to come out in the next few days. Well, next, presidential hopefuls in Tunisia began registering their candidacies for snap polls, which were called after the death of 92-year-old leader Beji Caid Essebsi. Submissions will be accepted through August 9th, and the Electoral Commission says the election will be held before November 3rd. Mario Sofos has more on the candidates so far.
There are already 8 candidates in Tunisia's presidential race, after registration opened on Friday. So far, Abia Moussi is the only female hopeful. Her party was formed from the remnants of that of former President Ben Ali, who was overthrown during 2011's revolution.
Our priority today is to restore order in Tunisia, to reinforce the Tunisian state and its institutions, to fight terrorism, to guarantee security for all.
Another candidate of note, Nabil Karoui, a businessman and media magnate recently charged with money laundering. He says he's the man to stand up for society's most deprived.
Our priorities are to get closer to the people, particularly, for example, to bring water to all Tunisians. These are our priorities. People do not have enough to drink or eat. The country has become poorer.
Karoui is seen as a fierce rival of Prime Minister Youssef Chahed. Though Chahed has not yet registered as a candidate, his party has announced that he will run in the election. He will also have to face rivals from the family of recently deceased President Beji Caid Essebsi.
The challenge is mainly within the government and not between the opposition and the government. It's between who I would call the legal successor, the legitimate candidate who should be prime minister, and an opposing faction loyal to the deceased president and his family, who are doing everything they can to make sure he doesn't succeed in this presidential race.
Initially planned for November, the elections have been moved forward to September 15th.
Well, next, in Hong Kong, demonstrations kicked off again this weekend ahead of a mass strike on Monday that will include schools and the transport sector. Hong Kong police on Saturday called on protesters to stick to designated routes and times, saying any demonstrations that are not pre-approved will be cleared out as unlawful assemblies. It's the 9th consecutive weekend of protests in the city. France 24's Daniel Quinlan is on the ground with more on how the movement has evolved.
I'd say it's fair to say that there's been an escalation in tensions today. The protests had mainly been confined to the weekends for the last 2 months they've been going on. And over the last recent period, you've just seen an escalation and diversification of tactics. There's been some blocking of trains, protests around police stations throughout the week. Last night there was a protest of civil servants, which is really unprecedented, and they'd been warned not to attend the protests. There'd also been a protest earlier from the financial workers and the financial districts. So they're 2 groups of people that you wouldn't immediately think of joining protests, which I guess is some indication of a broad level of support among the wider Hong Kong community here. This weekend, like other weekends, there's protest plans. Today we'll start marching shortly. There'll be a protest tomorrow, but the main day will be on Monday. Various people have called for a citywide strike, and some unions have already said that they'll take part in that. There's likely to be 7 different rallies across the city, and so it's going to potentially grind Hong Kong to a standstill.
Daniel Quinlan reporting from Hong Kong. Puerto Rico has a new governor. At least for now they do. Hundreds of people took to the streets in the capital of the U.S. territory, waving flags and cheering after Ricardo Rosselló resigned on Friday, delivering on his promise to do so. Veteran politician Pedro Pierluisi was sworn in to replace him, but he warned that his term could be cut short.
A jubilant countdown outside the Puerto Rico governor's mansion Friday evening as Governor Ricardo Rosselló officially stepped down. His resignation marked a first for the island, the result of weeks of mass protests over an explosive series of leaked chats between the governor and his aides. But even as Rosselló left office Friday, right on schedule, the process of appointing his successor has already reignited anger in the streets. The new governor is Pedro Pierluisi, a lawyer and member of the governing New Progressive Party, who was fast-tracked to become Secretary of State this week before being sworn in as governor on Friday. Pierluisi's appointment has raised objections not just from protesters, but from lawmakers in his own party. The island's House of Representatives confirmed him as Secretary of State Friday morning, a necessary step towards his becoming governor. The Puerto Rico Senate, however, did not vote to confirm him, as the body's president raised serious concerns about alleged conflicts of interest. With a legal battle brewing over the succession process, protesters aren't waiting to register their objections.
During the hearing, it became obvious that Pierluisi has conflicts of interest. He answers to the same big capitalists who have robbed this country.
Hundreds of protesters remained outside the governor's mansion as Pierluisi made his first speech as governor, setting the stage for a likely next phase of this unprecedented movement.
Well, staying with the U.S., Donald Trump's pick for U.S. spy chief has withdrawn his candidacy after questions arose about the congressman's lack of experience and possible exaggerations in his resume. Trump announced the move just 5 days after he surprised many in Washington by naming conservative Republican John Ratcliffe to replace Daniel Coats as Director of National Intelligence. Trump said that he had a list of 3 more people and that he will probably announce a new candidate by Monday.
I felt that Congressman Ratcliffe was being treated very unfairly. I was reading the press, and I think I am a student of the press, and I could see that the press was treating him, I thought, very unfairly. He's an outstanding man. And I asked him, I said, do you want to go through this for 2 or 3 months, or would you want me to maybe do something else? And he thought about it.
After a marathon 14-hour vote, European finance ministers have tapped Bulgarian Kristalina Georgieva to become the next leader of the International Monetary Fund. If her candidacy is approved, she will take over from Christine Lagarde as the second female head of the IMF. Yana Lee tells us more about the international policymaker.
She's one of the world's most powerful women. Kristalina Georgieva is the World Bank's second in command. Born to 2 high school graduates, the self-made woman obtained a PhD in environmental economics in 1986. The Bulgarian then started her career as an economist, publishing textbooks and working at renowned universities such as the LSE and MIT. In 1993, she joined the World Bank, where she garnered a reputation both as a hard worker and an easygoing colleague. Georgieva rose through the ranks of the international institution, and by 2008 she was its vice president. 2 years later, though, she was called on to become a EU commissioner for her native Bulgaria. She traveled the world working on humanitarian aid and budget. Georgieva later held key posts at the European Commission before launching her candidacy for United Nations Secretary General in 2016. Ultimately, Antonio Guterres won the top job, but the Bulgarian would find her spot as the CEO of the World Bank in 2017. Now, the majority of EU leaders want her to take on another role, managing director of the International Monetary Fund. By convention, the Washington-based lender is headed by a European, and Georgieva could become the first Eastern European to hold the position. But it's not a given. She'll be 66 soon, and IMF member states will have to change existing rules that state the director must be under 65. Emerging economies or even the UK could field their own candidates. They have until September 6th to do so.
Well, that's it from the newsroom. Thanks for watching and stay tuned. There's much more coming up on France 24. Don't go away.